You are listening to the Stand Out Now podcast with your host, Dave Mendonca. Check out each episode as top experts share their proven marketing, publicity, and sales tips to help you cut through the advertising noise so you can reach your ideal clients, get noticed, and connect with powerful influencers. The Stand Out Now podcast is brought to you by podcastinterviewexperts.com, helping entrepreneurs attract clients through business podcast guest appearances.
How's it going? Thanks for listening. I am joined with a man who is a big fan of podcasting, so much so, he co-founded a podcast agency called Pacific Content that connects brands to listeners in a real way with content they will love. Steve Pratt, thanks for being on the show.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Steve. So first off, curious, who is Steve Pratt? What's your career origin story?
I've been a media guy all my life. I've just always loved telling stories and figuring out ways to entertain people. I did about 10 years of TV at the start of my career and worked in a whole bunch of different genres of programming and different networks. And I don't know, every time I got to do something new or try a different style of programming, it was just like a whole new learning process. Maybe I get bored easily too. Okay. After doing about 10 years of TV, I did a couple years of kind of online only content at AOL. And then I did about 10 years at the Canadian public broadcaster at CBC in an area called CBC Radio 3 that is now kind of morphed into CBC Music as kind of an online music service and online music community.
Wow.
And then, I guess the last 4 years I've been podcasting exclusively, which has been a really weird one, fun, wild ride.
For sure. You're talking about the media, you're talking about TV, radio. I used to work in TV as well. The hours were terrible, like just the shift work. How did you deal with all that?
I was really young. I was just super excited. Like I've always had a pretty strong creative bent. You know, when I was a kid, I used to enjoy, writing stories and drawing and telling stories. And I got into doing some public speaking and improv and even, a bit of stand-up when I was in university.
Really?
And so to get a job in television where you're actually being broadcast and getting paid to tell stories and entertain people, it was just like a dream gig for me. So when you're young and you're excited and working in your dream gig, the hours don't really matter so much. I've had a lot of luck in my career of being in the right place at the right time and have been part of a lot of things very early on. And when you're helping to be part of a team that's building things, the passion factor, I think, outweighs the work factor. When I was saying earlier about, how I will occasionally get bored with things, I think, once things become routine or you've figured it out and it ends up that you're just kind of cranking out sausages.
Yep.
That's when I feel the pain around working long hours or weird things. When you're solving interesting problems or you're just super engaged in making something that you're proud of, I find that the time just kind of melts away and it doesn't bother me at all.
For sure. I love the nugget about you being a comedian. Give me a joke. Do you remember any of your jokes?
Oh, I don't think there's anything that I would want to share on this. It's funny. Like I find comedy, as you apply it back to whether it's marketing or storytelling or anything like that. But comedy I've just always loved it because the best comedy is always telling stories. It is always telling something that you kind of relate to. And it has some element that's really surprising as well. Like you laugh when you're surprised or when something happens that you're not expecting. And I think that is like such a bunch of good lessons for anybody, whether it's comedy or any other types of stories. If you can do things that people relate to and you surprise them and there's some elements that will grab your attention, you always win. So I always find the creativity of comedians and how they go about doing their style. There's always lessons outside of that.
Right. You talk about storytelling, Steve, and when you were a kid, I'm assuming you consumed a lot of movies, you read books, things like that?
Yeah. I was pretty voracious about, and honestly, like the scope would range from everything from like Kurt Vonnegut or John Irving to like Pet Detective and Fletch. So it's quite a broad gap of, or like I remember like being obsessed with the Far Side, like Gary Larson's cartoon when I was young too, just because it was really weird and just a really unique voice and sense of creativity in there.
Right. When you're a kid, okay, you're exploring the stories and whatnot. When you're a kid, like I don't know if you read comic books or like when you were going after certain things you wanted, like I don't know, it could be anything. It could be like a new video game or a toy. were there any like marketing strategies or promotional strategies unknowingly you employed to convince people to get you what you needed? I always love asking these types of questions to my guests because we don't think about it when we grow up. When we're little kids, we don't understand that we have these ways to persuade. And I'm always curious to find out what people did when they were younger. So do you have any persuasive techniques that you had back as a kid?
Well, you know, it probably would go back to humor a little bit again. Like I would say, like anybody who knows me would not say I'm like some cut up comedian sort of thing, but I have a good sense of humor. I think so. I moved around a lot as a kid. I was born in Montreal. I spent a chunk of time in Ottawa. I spent a chunk of time in Calgary, and I went to 2 different schools in the Toronto area from kind of high school onward. So I was fairly regularly in a situation where I was coming in as a new kid, having to make friends with people who have been in the same place for a long time and have a friend group established. And I always found humor was like an amazing way to kind of break the ice and entertain people as like an easy entry point. If you can make people laugh or have a different perspective on things, it's just super easy, I guess, as a as a strategy for how to fit in and have something unique about yourself.
Yeah.
I remember even in like school assignments, it was a really interesting rush to try and do something a little bit different or give it a bit of a twist where yours would stick out because it was different, even though like not in a bad way, but in a good way. You just took it to a different level by being a bit weird or creative with it. And honestly, I took that through my whole media career, and I would still say that today for almost everything. Is like I remember in job interviews in kind of my mid-career where people would say like, well, why should we choose you? What's interesting about you? And my default answer was always like, if you gave 10 people the exact same story, my goal is to be the only one that you remember because it's different. Is that I am not going to take the standard route to tell this story. I'm going to find a really interesting way to give it a twist or a quirk or something fun about it that is going to make it easier for you to remember it and go tell other people about it later. That always worked pretty well. Like for job interviews, it worked really well. But as a strategy for being able to like on the content side, or if you're doing a school assignment, or if you're even just in a social group, if you do have some sort of quirk that makes things memorable or interesting, or that is truly your own voice that you're giving your own point of view rather than giving the answer that you think other people want to hear, I've always found that really effective. And, you know, at the core of it is stuff that you find interesting and entertaining as well. And, you know, I remember, like, again, this is probably super boring. But,
no, not at all.
But just at that point when, you know, when the Far Side was really big and it was all this weird stuff with animals talking and weird things like that. Like I remember in grade 5 or something writing some story about vampire cows, and it was like the most fun thing. I just remember the joy of writing this thing for school about vampire cows and handing it in.
Right.
And the reaction it got, because it was so weird and unusual. Those are the sorts of things that I think stick with me a little bit.
Right.
Not that I'm making strays about vampire cows in my current context, but it's
for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think that's a great lesson to be learned, to always find your USP, your unique selling point, the uniqueness about you. Okay, so when you're different, how do you know that sells? So let's say you bring it to present day, like, okay, you talk about vampire cows and you want to make a podcast about that or something. Like, obviously a lot of testing goes into it before you burst that idea out to the public.
Well, it's interesting. Like I find that there's like almost like probably a Venn, like if you think about a Venn diagram, there's probably an overlap between what you're really good at and what is authentic to you versus what the audience is interested in. And being able to balance those two, I think, is where the sweet spot is of being able to do something sustainable that is genuinely coming from you and is not you trying to be something that you're not. I think there's a lot of people who will try and dissect what the audience wants and then morph themselves into being that. If that's truly who you are, that's awesome. But the part where you're like, you really are just yourself and you're finding that piece that other people are interested in about yourself, I think is the magic point to strive for.
For sure. So take me now, you talked about a little bit about your career leading up to the podcasting. And obviously podcasting has hit this incredible surge. In my opinion, we're at the state of like blogs were in 2005. I think that's where we are right now with podcasting. So like, when did podcasting start to click with you that maybe this is something I could sink my teeth in?
I started a long time ago. So I was at CBC, and I'd been hired to kind of come in and take this online music service called CBC Radio 3 and turn it into a satellite radio station as part of like a new offering. And the satellite radio wasn't launching in Canada for at least a year. So this is, I think, late 2004. And we had this amazing asset of a website that was kind of like MySpace, where a bunch of independent Canadian musicians uploaded their music and people could make playlists and listen to the music on demand. And I started hearing this thing called podcasting. And I remember it was Adam Curry, the old MTV VJ, doing this thing called the Daily Source Code. And it was not easy to get podcasts, but it was super interesting that he was using a new way to distribute audio, and you could listen to it on iPod. And at some point in there, we realized there's no music podcasts. There's nothing that is a legal music podcast out there. And we're sitting on all of these independent musicians who own their own rights. And the whole purpose of our service is to give them new exposure and help them build a career. So we added a waiver to give musicians the ability to give us permission to podcast their music. And we launched it in spring of 2005. And then about a month later, iTunes put podcasting inside iTunes and made it really easy to get going. And because it was a legal music podcast from a reputable public broadcaster, they put it all over the world, and it blew up. And it almost like podcasting became an equal pillar to the satellite radio in this service, where we had tons of amazing artists that were early in their careers. So, I mean, the success of it was also hugely part of the music. We had Arcade Fire and Tegan and Sarah and Broken Social Scene and New Pornographers and Feist, like all sorts of amazing people really early in their careers were part of this show. But we kind of got the podcasting bug there, and we actually built out almost like a little mini music podcasting network that did pretty well for several years. And then I think YouTube and Facebook and a bunch of other things came along, and it's almost like podcasting receded back until Serial came out a few years ago. And then it's just been on fire, crazy, growing ever since then.
In your opinion, why is it so red hot?
I think there's a couple things. I think so. Apple putting the podcast app as a default thing in the phone, where it's there and you can make it easy, was one big factor. I think shows like Serial coming out, where it becomes part of a cultural conversation, and you start seeing the team from Serial, like Sarah Koenig, on late night TV and being written up in mainstream places like the New York Times or Entertainment Weekly or those sorts of places. That put something in front of people who've never listened to a podcast before and brought a ton of people into the tent. And I think the technology has gotten a lot better, and data plans have gotten a lot better, and the ability to connect phones to your car has gotten a lot better. I think just a lot of people are understanding that this can be like Netflix for radio, where I don't have to listen to what's on or what's being programmed. I can choose and program my own commute with stuff that is just for me, or my own workout or dog walk or whatever it is. And I think in a way, the first 10 years was also about making it really easy for anybody to be able to make a show and publish it, which meant that there's a lot of long form interview shows. Serial changed the perception of what a podcast could be as something that was not on the radio and was just unbelievable world-class storytelling and production values that I think brings in a much broader audience than a long-form talk show. So I think that kicked off a bunch of things where you're seeing different formats of shows that are, I don't know, just designed for a broader audience to bring in more people. And I think we're still in really early days for that, where there's a ton of formats and a ton of, I don't know, types of programming and content categories that have not been figured out in the podcasting space yet.
Are there any that you see on the horizon in terms of formats?
Well, it's interesting that I think you're starting to see more fiction come out in podcasting. I don't know why we haven't seen formats that work really, really well on TV or movies come into the space yet. Like there's not been a breakout game show or soap opera or sitcom. There's not been a ton of like lifestyle programming that have broken out in the way that things have done there. I love that Wolverine came to podcasting. When you think about what works in movies, superheroes are huge there. And now there's a Wolverine podcast. And I think you're going to see more and more, not just podcasts getting licensed and going into TV and movies, but TV and movies licensing their properties or their ideas to get turned into really successful podcasts.
It's really fascinating to me just seeing this immersion of how like podcasts are heading towards like television, other forms of media. I wonder, like Hollywood, I don't know, in my opinion, I think Hollywood's really hard pressed for ideas, new ideas. And I think they're looking everywhere for new stories to tell. And it's great that you have podcasting that has all these people that, may not be mainstream, but they really have large engaged audiences. And I guess the Hollywood execs, they're like, hey, maybe we should take a listen. Maybe we should take notice. And you're seeing this now. So I agree with you. We're on the verge. We're on the verge of something really special here. And it's really building momentum. And now
it's quite interesting too. If you think about other mediums and what's suitable to get turned into a TV show or a movie, a lot of the other mediums, like the digital mediums right now, are very short form and snack size. And they're not really telling longer, meaty stories. That is not building huge depth of connection with characters over an arc or big emotional content where you have a really deep engagement. The nature of a podcast is that you can have a half hour or an hour show that takes its time and builds in that level of engagement and storytelling and connection with characters. There's like no judgment against any other platform. It's just that people don't consume stuff on a phone with a screen in that same way. But when you're commuting to work, you're super happy to take half an hour to do that, or whatever the activity is that you're doing when you're podcasting. It's usually not something where you're sitting there staring at your screen. You're doing something else and you want to be entertained and engaged.
For sure. It's interesting when you think about how fragmented the media space is. Like a Seinfeld TV sitcom in the 90s can like have 30 million people watch. But today, that content's consumed in so many different ways that if you're a TV executive, you're losing, like the TV network is losing millions of dollars of advertising because of the fragmentation. And it's just really great to see, we have all this choice now. And it's great for the end consumer. And I love how podcasting is just so accessible. You can go to the gym and listen to a podcast. And it's a fantastic new development. And the way
it's interesting, when you think about all that fragmentation, it is 100% bad news for a traditional media company.
Bingo.
But the really interesting opportunity is anybody can do this. You have to do a great job, but anybody can do it. That's the really exciting thing about where we are right now. But the caveat is it has to be awesome.
True.
When you talk about moving from what's on versus I'm going to choose the thing that is perfect for me,
right.
Every single time people are evaluating, is this worth my time and attention? And so, being able to be amazing in a very small niche or being phenomenal with a big, broad program, there's a whole spectrum of different choices that anybody can go into, as long as at the end of it, people are like, that was totally worth it. I'm glad I spent half an hour with that. It was amazing.
Right.
I think we're in an age where mediocrity is not going to be a good strategy.
Yeah.
Maybe it never was, but I feel like there's been a lot of mediocrity in specialty channels and things like that.
There are so many channels out there. I don't know how they even exist. Like, have you heard of the channel Bounce? Apparently, there's a Bounce TV. What is that? I don't know.
I don't know, but I'm assuming people are bouncing from it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're talking about audio storytelling. We're talking about podcasting. I want you to lead us to how Pacific Content came to be and how you filled the gap. What was the gap, and what did you fill it with?
Yeah, so there were about 3 different factors that led to what we're doing right now. So one was the serial factor in the Apple Podcast app of just seeing there is a market out there for really high quality audio programming, and there's not a lot of it out there in the podcast space. The other one was the fragmentation and a lot of advertising money leaving traditional media and going into the digital space. And part of that is just consumers being empowered to be able to choose what they want and what they don't want, and being able to skip ads or bypass them. With subscription services where there aren't ads, people don't want to waste their time with things that they don't like, and they can choose, between things that they like or things that they love. They're always going to choose the thing they like or they love. Sorry.
Sure.
So those 2 factors, and then you add in something like Red Bull or GoPro, where you see companies that are acting like media companies and building truly original shows that are not about promoting their products. It's shows that are designed for the audience that they want to reach, to make them happy and that, embody the values or the emotions of the brand. Mm-hmm. But, Red Bull, what do they want you to feel when you watch a snowboarding event or a mountain biking event or somebody jumping from outer space. They want you to feel an adrenaline rush, which is what Red Bull makes you feel when you drink it. But there's no product shots. There's no people chugging Red Bulls. There's none of the sell on the Red Bull. It's just, we're going to make an amazing network of programming that makes you have an adrenaline rush. And there's nobody doing that in audio at all for any company. But I think for all of us as traditional media people, the ability for any company to be able to think and act like a media company and make a show that makes their target audience really happy, right, where the audience will opt in and say, I voluntarily am signing up to get a half hour of content every week or two from you and to put your brand in my ears because you're creating value for me, felt like a no-brainer value proposition for audiences because we could make really high quality programming, and for brands to be able to build up an audience really quickly by thinking differently and not making heavy-handed marketing.
And that's what Pacific Content does, if I'm correct. It creates these branded podcasts for brands. And can you let the audience know, what is a branded podcast? For the entrepreneur listening at home or wherever, what is a branded podcast?
This is actually I'll try and be concise about this. So we may have invented the term branded podcast. We're certainly one of the first people to make them and to popularize the term. But we had this idea. We went and pitched it to Slack, and we had no idea whether this was going to be viable. And Slack said yes. So we were like super, super lucky that the first people we pitched said yes. And they have been an amazing client to work with. But we kind of got a yes, and we're like, oh, we have to invent this thing.
Oh, man.
So we kind of created this process of digging into their brand and their voice and their values and their business goals, and then trying to create a show that people would really love listening to that was not actually about Slack or its products or services. It was, so it ended up kind of being a show about like the future of work and the pain points of modern work that had a fun, quirky side to it, called Slack Variety Pack. And we put it out, and it got all sorts of really interesting press because no one could fully understand why they were doing it, but they really enjoyed the show. And
Right.
I remember one of the headlines in like Forbes or something like that was, Slack is making a podcast for some reason.
Oh, nice.
And I was like, this is awesome. And anyways, it took off and it got tons of listeners. And then we kind of used that as a proof of concept to be able to go out and hang out our shingle saying we make branded podcasts. And we got a bunch more clients for the rest of that year. We had, Shopify and Zendesk and a company called Envoy in San Francisco. We did a really fun show with them called Office Hacks, an education company called Hobson's.
Wow.
And every year it kind of grew to bigger and bigger brands where we started working with Prudential and then Zendesk and Dell and Mozilla and McAfee.
Wow.
And then Mozilla has been a big one that in the last year for us. We just wrapped up a season with Charles Schwab, which is really fun and a great show.
Wow.
But the interesting point is in the middle of that, we realized, we're making good shows, but we don't actually have a way to guarantee or have a really high degree of confidence that these are going to find the same level of audiences that the Slack show found. And it was almost like a bit of a crapshoot depending on how the show did. And so we spent a fair bit of time digging in and building out an audience development strategy specifically for brands. Okay. And one of the pieces was actually not using the term branded podcast anymore. It was changing it to original podcasts with brands. And it was a very deliberate thing, and it's been very successful because, when you say branded podcast, it comes with a lot of baggage. You think like it smells like marketing just when you say it. And, for audiences, when you say, oh, how do you like to listen to a branded podcast? There's a barrier to wanting to give it a try or giving it a fair shake as a show. And there's a reason, I think there's a lot of stuff that is still fairly heavy handed that is called a branded podcast out there, that they're not all the same level of brand touch in the shows. Right. We wanted to make shows, like I said, that are really like our clients are media companies making people's favorite shows. And when we started thinking about this idea of original podcasts with brands, it felt more like the challenge was there for a listener to say like it's an original podcast and not a branded thing that is trying to sell you something. And for our clients to be able to get everybody from day one to understand your job is to make an amazing show that is going to be the favorite show of the people you want to listen to this. It just set a higher bar for everything there. And then as we kind of worked on some of the other areas of audience development, building out a lot of the secret strengths that brands have in their back pocket and in some cases haven't ever used for content before, has been amazing at creating a consistency of building audiences really quickly out of the gate. So I don't know, just like a couple examples, like
Sure.
Mozilla uses the Firefox browser. Like when you open a new tab, if the podcast has put out a new episode, there's a promo for the podcast, but it's not for Firefox. It's not selling anything. It's here's an amazing episode. So the conversion on it is great and people love it and tons of people listen. The Charles Schwab show is called Choiceology. It's about behavioral economics and how to make better decisions, but it is not about finances or investment or selling you Schwab products, but they promote it in their website, their mobile app, email newsletters. They have a print magazine that goes to 2.5 million people. They've got branches all over the place where they can put in digital signage. All of those things have let them go from like zero to a really considerable audience in 7 episodes. So that's been a really, really fun part of doing this too.
Right.
That was a really long answer. Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, I'm just listening. I'm just absorbing. I think that's the trend of marketing today is it's about giving the customers meat, not slamming them over the head with marketing messages. And these podcasts, these original podcasts with brands that you're putting together, they're nailing the mark. Now, I just want to go back a little bit when Pacific Content was first starting. So you're trying to convince brands to hop on the train with you. So what are you doing? Like you were talking a little bit about how you developed a piece of content and then you went to the brands and said, this is what we do. Like right from the start, is that what you did? The proof of concept right away? Because if I'm a startup right now and I'm trying to glean a tip from when you started, what's a way to make me stand out and get that sale?
Well, it's interesting. Like I think maybe a couple things. So the first one I think was that we tried to tell a story when we went in to talk to a potential client. And the story was trying to get them out of being a marketing person in a particular company and getting them to think like the audience and, what they do with their TV shows. Like, do you PVR and skip the ads? Do you, do you change radio stations when an ad block comes on in your car? How much have your patterns changed from seeing what's on TV to having a set of recordings or going into Netflix? And everybody does that. Like there's very few people who will not admit to wanting to personalize their experience and bypass ads. And at the core of it, it's because they don't like them. So your solution is either you have to make ads that are so good that people want to stick around. And I think there's been some really awesome experimentation with that in the podcast space where people are really rethinking ads and making them content and entertainment that people enjoy. Or you could be the show and build an audience of people who love you because you're making an amazing show. Mm-hmm. And kind of walking people through the steps of like putting them in their own situation and asking them what they would want to consume turned on a lot of light bulbs. And you could almost see certain people like the light bulb would just go off and they get it and get excited about it. As we've kind of evolved the company, our shows have been the best marketing for our company. Like this is a weird thing to say, but we're really, really lucky that we kind of helped popularize this branded podcast term very early and got a lot of SEO around it early because I think almost all of our new leads are inbound. We don't do a lot of outbound marketing except for blogging about podcasting. And almost all of it is people researching or reading about one of our shows or reading an article or an interview we've done and going to our website and filling out a contact us form, or we're getting like really big, interesting brands show up in my inbox filling out a contact us form. Like it's a bit surreal. Like I said, I feel like we're in a really lucky space that we're not doing a lot of outbound marketing. But in a way, that's the whole philosophy of what we're trying to sell to clients is, you make things that people like and people find out about it. And eventually people come in the door qualified because they understand what you're doing and they appreciate what you're doing. So without having to sell people really hard on it.
Right. So, Steve, you don't get the brands that say, listen, I want to know my ROI up front. Like, I'm all about metrics. I'm all about testing. Like, I want my numbers. Like, what do you tell those guys?
I hope this doesn't sound too like weird or obnoxious, but like we will tell them you shouldn't do this then. Like we decided we are not going to say yes to clients that are not going to find success in the space. On the media side, this is a really rare opportunity to be part of like a medium or a platform that has not yet been fully figured out, where you can kind of help invent where the industry is going. And for our particular like super weird niche of just doing shows with brands, we want this to be a viable, successful strategy. And we want brands who come in and work with us to have a fantastic experience. So this is designed really only at top of funnel brand awareness level. As soon as you start trying to sell people things in the short term, if somebody comes in and says, I want to boost my sales in the next 3 months, let's do a podcast to do that. I'm like, it's not a good fit for that. Like direct response ads in podcasting are fantastic for that. And that's the right, kind of solution for you in the podcasting universe. If you want to build your brand and let lots of people know what you stand for and build a fantastic, deep, ongoing relationship with people over time, making your own podcast is phenomenal compared to almost any other channel. The level of engagement, the level of brand recall and brand lift, because you're making something that people genuinely like, is phenomenal. But in a way, part of our job is to try and qualify people out very quickly if it's not the right thing for their business strategy.
Mm-hmm. Take me into the content creation. Like, where do you hire your announcers? Like, do the brands supply announcers? Like the shows themselves, the structures? Like, who determines all that? Is it strictly up to Pacific Content? Like, how does that work?
We are super collaborative. So we kick off every project with a new client where we go to their offices for a couple days and we go through a pretty big series of workshops. One is digging pretty deep into the brand so that we understand it and we understand what the business goals are. And then we go through a program development workshop that is collaborative, where we go through almost all these different decisions that you have to make to be able to make a great show. And so some of them will be like a host, like you're saying. And there's a spectrum of choices you can go on. One could be, do you want to have kind of an anonymous host that is just a fantastic voice that sounds like what you want your brand to sound like in audio? The pros on that one, it doesn't cost very much. You get to customize it. There's no risk of associating your brand with like a person who could put something weird on Twitter someday, or,
Right.
And then you can go, kind of in the middle ground to somebody who is a moderate presence in your industry, who brings some authenticity and credibility to that and might bring in people in your industry. And then there's all the way up to, there could be somebody really prominent hosting your show that truly brings this into the realm of like an original show, and they bring their own audience and people are going to be super curious to hear a show from that person. So every one of those is an individual choice for a brander on what the right fit is for them. And that's where we work collaboratively to kind of match their strategy and their goals with what the right solution is. And it could be the same thing with the format of the show, the types of stories they tell, the types of emotions they want to convey in the podcast. All those things are really meaty discussions to have before you land on what the show's actually going to be.
Right. So you're telling me, just to touch upon a bit earlier, you're getting these inbound emails from big brands. So these guys come to you. Do you understand how many entrepreneurs would love that scenario?
Yeah, and that's why I feel weird saying it. Like, I feel embarrassed that we are that fortunate to be in that position. Like, if I was going to dissect it, I would say is we were really early doing something that nobody else was doing.
Yeah.
We got the SEO piece of it and we tried to make the best possible stuff that we can. So, I think we look at how, I'll give you two different scenarios maybe for if you were a brand out there, there's going to be a group of people who are interested in podcasting and are going to say like, wow, this might be a really interesting thing for us. I've heard a lot about companies making podcasts. What's my next step? I'm probably going to go start researching and Googling to see who makes interesting podcasts or who makes the shows that are the ones that I've been reading about. We will usually be very fortunate to come up in those search results or their research process where they're going to reach out to us with a handful of other companies in the podcast industry. The weird thing for us is we're pretty much the only company that just does this. So there's other companies that have their own networks and make their own original shows and sell ads. And this is a part of their business, but it is not the sole focus of their business. We're the only one that kind of can get on a call and say, we've been doing this and nothing but this. This is where all of our passion is working with people like you. And we've designed all these parts of our business that are 100% designed just to work with brands and find success with brands. So I think if we get into a situation where people are researching, we're usually in the mix for it because of the crazy deep nerd focus we have on all this stuff.
Right.
And then, like through more traditional marketing things, like we've gone to certain types of more broad marketing events where you can go meet different CMOs or different people in different companies. And the difference when you talk to somebody who is not a podcast fan and try and explain our business to them, it's like the conversion rate of somebody who's coming in inbound researching podcasting versus talking to somebody who may be more interested in marketing automation or something like that.
Right.
It's night and day. It's a really hard sell to somebody who is not a podcast listener around why they might want to do something like this. So
Right.
I guess in a way, our strategy has been figure out how to make ourselves really easy to find if you're interested in podcasting for your company.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're doing it. You're getting some great brands. I'm looking at your website, and you have these big time companies. It's not Joe's Bakery around the street or on the street. You know, these are legit people, so legit brands. So you're doing a great job, Steve. And just wondering, where can people find out more about Pacific Content?
Our website is probably the best place, pacific-content.com. Yeah, just like everybody else, Google us, I guess, Pacific Content.
Sure.
Yeah.
Awesome, Steve. Listen, thank you so much for being on the show. A lot of insight. Really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, have a great week.
Thank you for listening to the Stand Out Now podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes and rate and review it as well. You can find out more about our program at thestandoutnowpodcast.com. Thanks again and enjoy your week.